budget was small and the time allocated was short, but sometimes working with those restrictions can actually be quite a good thing for the project. You're sort of forced to think in different ways sometimes. I'm a creative director, producer, designer, occasional animator and illustrator. And I work across games, animation and digital projects. So I'm going to talk today about some of the things I've made over the last 15 years. Some highs, some lows, and how I've sort of survived and what I've kind of learned along the way, really. So I'll just give you a little bit about my background. I studied fine art originally and printmaking. And at the end of those 3 years, I couldn't quite have an idea of what I sort of wanted to do. But when I sort of was scouring and thinking, I looked and I saw a course in Brighton. And then it sort of all clicked. The thing that brought together the things I was interested in was telling stories. And that's kind of the theme that runs through the work. How disparate it is and all the different platforms, it's all kind of about storytelling. I did this MA in Brighton and I stayed here. So this was back in the mid-90s. And I started originally my first actual bit of work in designers, we're at the height of the CD-ROM industry, and I originally started making with other companies games and educational games and things like that, but I was also lecturing and teaching at the same time. And then in the year 2000, a sort of chance meeting with a friend of a friend led to the inception of this company called Little Loud. We've actually closed the company in 2013, but due to this as the bulk of the work that I've done, I'm just going to be the majority of this talk, and there is a kind of an arc to it, where we started and where we sort of ended up. What was Little Loud? So it started as a sort of new media company, at the height of that new media boom in 2000, but then we became an animation company when we had the chance, and ultimately we made a game. We were a games company and an entertainment company. So we started with two owners, myself as a sort of creative director, and a partner who took care of more of the business side of things. So he was there to try and get in and bring in work and look after the paperwork, but we kind of crossed over a little bit as well. At our largest, we were around 20 people, with a mix of sort of really brilliantly skilled people, really creative people, and from all different disciplines. So we had 3D modelers, we had animators, we had designers, developers, producers, and game designers and writers. Some of them worked for us, and some of them we worked with in sort of freelance capacity. And we ended up having clients like BBC, Channel 4, Paramount, Universal, Sony. But just to give you a little taster of the kind of thing we did, I'll just play you this show reel. So that just gives you a little overview of some of the different things we did over our 13 odd years. We kind of started out as a kind of what they call a digital agency. So that meant we worked for brands and things like that on things like their websites. And our sort of first major contract was with Bacardi. So we were quite lucky in that, you know, you often need a lot of money to start a company. You know, you need premises and you need computers, you need equipment, you need kit, all these kind of overheads. But luckily we kind of, well, I say luckily, my business partner kind of stole them as a client. So basically, instead of having all these setup costs, we had our first paycheck from Bacardi to set up the business. So in that respect, we were kind of pretty lucky. So we've sort of started without any kind of debts. So from there, we kind of tooled up, employed, we got our small offices. The advantage of working for those kind of brands at that time is that you got like a yearly retainer. So you knew how much money you're going to have year on year. So you can allocate how much you're going to get every month. The disadvantage is that you're working for brands. But I'll come to that in a little bit. So we were kind of the digital agency, and we started selling in ideas. You know, we were building their site, and we were doing all that kind of thing, but we were kind of started selling in ideas that were more around what we were interested in. So we were selling in game ideas, and we were selling in animation ideas. And this included pitching an animated series about to Bacardi Breezer about an animated cat, which we actually got money to make a pilot for until a lawyer turned around and said, maybe you shouldn't be making animation at what something is called Alcapops. So that kind of got scuppered pretty early on, but we got a whole pilot out of it, and we got to learn all the different skills to make an animated pilot. But that wasn't really what we were interested in. I wasn't really interested in making websites. I still really am, but I find it really boring. So we kind of made a push while this was going on, inroads into other areas and kind of people that we knew we could get the kind of work that we were interested in. So what we did in those early days, we pushed into, with games, we pushed into the BBC. So this was early doors, and we started initially working for preschool channel CBeebies. So they were making a lot of digital content at that time, and we made quite a lot of things, quite smaller projects, some of them slightly bigger, for some of them originals ideas and some of them to tie into TV series. So this is like one for Quiz, sort of CBeebies TV program. But it's quite limiting working for preschools, and there's a lot of repetition, and it didn't really, again, I wanted to move on to slightly older ages, so we got to move on and we got to push in, and we got inroads to CBBC, so a little age band up. And we worked on different programs. These were generally sort of tie-ins to existing programs, and they made digital games to go online to support those. So things like Stupid, and we made games for Horrible Histories, and we eventually got in and got work with like the BBC, and we made games for things like Little Britain. So that's one avenue work. While we're doing that, we're also making a sort of mix between our brand work and the sort of games work. We ended up getting with Universal Studios and Paramount, and that's actually with one guy who moved between the two companies. He sort of really liked work with us. There's a lot of trust there, and we end up working on a lot of big movie titles because they have a whole sort of sweep of different things that support like the launch of films, and then one of those was like we made a lot of interactive experiences and we made a lot of games. So we made things like games for Iron Man, and this is an interesting one because this is where we don't only push sort of creative things, but we could push technically. So we'd never made a 3D game, and we'd never made a Unity game, and this is really early days of a program called Unity, which is like really accessible, makes 3D games. But we use that as a test bed to try and make one of those and use that as part of our kind of, hey, we can do this portfolio of things. So yeah, Kung Fu Panda was another one, Transformers, things for Watchmen, and some of them were like slightly more interesting and slightly more creative ideas. Some of them were a bit weird. We made a game to tie into a Coen Brothers movie, which kind of worked, but it was kind of an odd concept. But you know, if you're working for a client, there's a little bit of give and take, and so you know, you might work on all these kind of exciting titles and exciting films, and then now and then you have to do a Barbie: The Magic of Pegasus. But the advantage of running your own company is that you don't have to do that; just someone else in your company has to do that. But you know, some things just pay the bills. But you know, we got to do some interesting things as well. So these were all lived online, and you know, games that were mainly playable through browsers. Some of them playable through apps. But we did occasionally make things that lived in different spaces. So we were approached by the Science Museum to make a game for Wallace and Gromit to tie into like a sort of, what's it called? I can't remember what it's called now, but basically the government body that promotes industry around the world. And it was all to do with like inventions. So it was all to do with like Wallace and Gromit and their inventions. And so this whole theme was themed around, this whole exhibition was themed around Wallace and Gromit and their inventions. So they wanted a game that they could play there. And what was quite interesting about it is it had sort of different rules. So it had to be a game that could be played by multiple people, and it could be played really quickly. It was really quick to understand. And also, it couldn't be played for too long because it's got a flow of people, and you couldn't have a massive people track around there. So it was interesting sort of challenge in the design of it. And also, it was sort of built into this sort of giant Wallace and Gromit style cabinet, and we had to sort of wire in joysticks and buttons and things like that. So it was kind of a fun project. But these are the sort of different strands that we were interested in following. And we were also really interested in animation. So, you know, that's a thing that I was really interested in. I was really interested in storytelling. I was really interested in telling stories with animation. And there was, you know, I think we've been working on these sort of brand things for quite some time. And I was getting a little bit itchy feet in terms of the work that we were doing. And so I think it was just 2003, 2004, something like that. You know, I sort of went off and had a couple of weeks at home doing this little idea. You know, we wanted to go in a different direction. We wanted to do more sort of bigger ideas, but we had sort of mouths to feed at that point. We had monthly overheads. We had a staff to look after. So it was quite tricky in terms of trying to steer the company in different ways. It had to be, you know, done in ways that were economical. You had to buy a bit of time here, buy a bit of time there. But, you know, we did this little thing, this little animation. I took 2 weeks out. And it's quite crude. And it's quite sort of unpolished. But it just was a little animation made in Flash. And we put it together and we sent it out to, like, all our clients. And we sent it out to some of the people that we wanted to work with as well. And some people just liked it. It was a bit of fun. It was good. It was a little fresher that we're still here, still there. But also give a little inkling of kind of other things that we could do that people didn't know that we did. And so it was picked up by a guy that worked at Channel 4. And at that time, they had like a kids sort of division that was called Grid Club. And he really liked this. And he came back to us and said, you know, we really like the animation and I'd be really interested in seeing what you could do, you know, pitch us some ideas. So that was great. There's a little inroad. And we thought about what we would like to do. And we came up with this idea of pitching these 5-minute animations of classic stories. And they really liked that. They liked that idea. So it was a really nice project. We could pick the stories that we wanted. There was a little bit of feedback, but mainly it was positive. They let us kind of pick the stories that we wanted to tell. And so we ended up doing, let's see here, Troy, we did Midsummer Night's Dream, Christmas Carol, Jabberwocky. We covered quite a lot of space when they were written, quite a disparate range of stories and different complexity. And they're sort of aimed at sort of 6, 7, 8-year-olds. So they gave us quite a lot of creative freedom to just kind of get on and do it. Now, the budget was small and the time allocated was short, but sometimes working with those restrictions can actually be quite a good thing for the project. You know, you're sort of forced to think in different ways sometimes. And this one, you know, look, again, they're pretty crude. They're sort of produced in the early days of sort of the Flash program, used them to animate in Flash. But the first one we did was a Christmas Carol, and they really liked that. And that gave us, then gave us the budget to do like 4 more over the course of about a year and a half. So it led to repeat work, so that was really good. So I'll just sort of drill into it a little bit more. So these are some stills from the one that we did, which was about the Siege of Troy, or the Iliad, as you might know it. So the first thing to do, once you pick the story that you're going to tell, is figure out how do you kind of condense it and adapt it to like 5 minutes. So if you know the story of the Iliad, it covers a mass of characters, numerous battles, and covers around 10 years of time. So it was quite a challenge to try and think, how do you condense this story down into like 5 minutes? So it's trying to pick out those sort of key beats and those key like story moments that you were going to illustrate. You're never going to tell all of it, but you could tell key moments. And you could choose those moments you're going to show and make sure that they all sort of ran together to form a sort of coherent story. So broke it down into those beats. Then we started working on a script at the same time, sort of breaking it down into like thumbnails. So these are before we even get to storyboard. So just like illustrating those beats, either like stick guys and just what's in each scene. So just get an idea of the flow of the story. But so I kind of draw as well. So quite handily I can, you know, as a director, I can draw my own storyboard, so I can think about each shot and how I want it to work. And it's the disadvantage being I'm the only one to blame for it. But it means that you've got that control over the camera and how you want things to work. So I would make these storyboards, and then our process always for animation is to take those storyboards and make what you probably know is an animatic. So you take all those still images and then you slap them in a timeline, and you usually got your VO recorded at that point, and so you're basically making an edit with still pictures. So you're not wasting any time animating anything you don't need that you're going to edit out afterwards. So you make a pretty tight edit using just the storyboards. So once those sort of asset sort of boards are all done, I would sort of like double up, and to save time, use the storyboards as the foundation for all the assets that I would need. So you can see there I'm sort of using the storyboards to trace over in Illustrator and make all the different characters and all the different elements I was going to need for each shot and each scene. And Troy was a really nice one to do, because it was I thought a lot about colour, and I thought a lot about really restricting the palette. So I looked a lot at sort of Greek pots and Greek urns, and what was really interesting about looking at those is before I just looked at them and just looked at them as a bit of decoration. I'd looked at them as a bit of, you know, just a bit of decor. But actually, if you look at those pots, if you look at them in depth, they actually, a lot of them tell stories in a kind of circular way around the pot, and they tell the stories of the Iliad. They tell all different stories. They're quite graphic, they're quite violent, they're quite horrible, some of them. And that was kind of an inspiration. That sort of formed sort of the colour palettes and the sort of the stylings of the animation. So while they're not up there with like Disney or TV animation, you know, they were quite little breakthroughs for us. And each time we did one, we could push things in a different way, and we could try out different experiments. We could try out, and what we did do is try out different styles. So each one that we did in a very different style. You know, the Troy one looks very different to this, which is slightly more cartoony. So this is from Jabberwocky. And what advantage of that was, it kept it a bit fresh for us as well. So every time we did one, we had a fresh kind of art direction and a fresh look to it. So it was kind of exciting, quite fun. It's kind of intense. We'd probably take, to do one of these, about 5 weeks. And the first couple were done with me and probably one or two others. Slightly bigger teams at the end. But I think it was easier that way because we were learning as we went. We were figuring out not only how to do them ourselves, but then figuring out how to work as a team to do them. How do you break it up, and how do you allocate and distribute the work between different people? I'll just show you a quick trailer. So that was, sort of our 2D animation and sort of doing Flash. But as we sort of progressed and we got into animation more, we started working in sort of 3D, and we sort of put in 3D modelers and 3D animators. And sort of started telling stories and developing things using 3D programs and developing things for television and for bigger screens. So this is a project we made for Sony, sort of promoting, it was like a promotional piece for their iToy they had at the time. So that combined lots of different 2D, 3D techniques. We also really focus heavily on character design and character animation. We were never making stuff that was super high end, but we occupied a nice sort of space between mega expensive London animation agencies and sort of smaller companies, so we could take on sort of really interesting sort of mid-sized jobs. So we would design characters and then build them in sort of 3D. This is for a series of shorts we made for a charity called Family Link. Here's some little dudes that we designed and animated for a Channel 4 program called Mixtape. And here's some stills from a animation we did called, I'll play this in the background, for a band called One Giant Leap. So this was a really fun project to do. And they basically gave us completely free rein. So One Giant Leap used to make, they made albums, and they had loads of guest stars and different people on it. But as part of the album, they also made a film. So they made a documentary. So they go around the world recording with these different recording artists, but also film lots of interviews. So there'd be lots of talking head interview shots, but then they'd have different animators and different people sort of responding to some of the songs and cut that into the film. So they asked us to basically make a video for one of the songs that could be sort of cut into the film. So we sort of went away and we had some ideas, and we came back with these little 4 sort of vignettes that that illustrate this part of the film. And it was a really nice challenge because we wanted to mix up sort of a 2D and 3D and make a kind of 3D animation that looked like it was hand painted and make it look like it was two-dimensional. So we worked to get this kind of pencil effect on the 3D and on the rendering, and to get that painterly effect on the colour. So we were really pleased with that as a little side project. So these are all shorts. These are all 2-3 minutes long. But this sort of led and it progressed, and we were sort of building on that work until eventually we got to pitch for a BBC project. We got to pitch for a Doctor Who animation in, I've forgotten when it was, a few years ago, 2010, 2009, something like that. It was the end of David Tennant's run. So we pitched for that, and it was kind of an interesting ride. It was very different to what we'd done before. It was 45 minutes long. It was a 6-7 month project. We had 3-4 animators working on it, and there was quite a lot of pressure all tied into it because it had a hard deadline. It had to go out before Christmas. It was on Red Button, it was on CBBC, it was on BBC. And you had all of the... put it this way, I've been into pitches before, and you have 2 or 3 people and you pitch your idea. I went into this Doctor Who pitch, there was 14 people sat around a table. And I don't know where they all come from, and some of them I never saw again. But yeah, it was quite a big sort of thing for them. So it was a real challenge, but it was really interesting. There was lots of, again, creative restrictions that enforced things that you had to decide. So you had a lot of animators that were used to working on, 2 weeks on a shot, 1 week on a shot, and we had lots of they read the script, and it was just people running everywhere. And for an animator to produce a really good run cycle, it takes a good week, 2 weeks. And they go, we go and go, yeah, that's great, but we've got a day. And so, they were under real pressure. So there was lots of stuff where we go, yeah, that's great. Let's just move the camera up so you don't see their legs. Which goes back to a great bit of Terry Gilliam advice, that if you have to draw a character walking, have them in a really long coat or in long grass. So yeah, we had lots of that going on in there. But we tried to make the most of it and tried to make it as impressive as we could for the time and for the budget. So it was all done in sort of 3D. And sort of rendered out and then composited, and we had lots of effects over the top. So we had to work out a real big pipeline. We had to actually expand to another office where we could fit the animators in. And we had to get a whole render farm so we could render everything and take all that into account. So there's a real scaling up and a real sort of pressure, but it was a kind of interesting challenge, I guess, is the way to put it. So these are some of the concept designs. So this sort of led into things where you got these working on other people's ideas. So we would pitch them in. People go, we want this thing. We pitch in an idea, but we also got to pitch in some of our own ideas. So we worked on a TV pilot called Tourists from Mars, and we got some money to make a pilot for that and some shorts. So we did get a chance to sort of work up and develop our own ideas as well. And again, some of this stuff would go on telly, some of this stuff would live online, but sometimes you would develop things for spaces. So this was a project we did for the London Transport Museum, and so it was a kind of this 4 HD monitors, which would show, basically you would split your video over these, and it would slide on and slide off. And it played over this sort of background. So we just did this animated sort of section in the middle. So it was kind of like the equivalent of having working on 4 TV screens. We kept it really high resolution. We didn't blow it up. We kind of worked at it at that 4 TV size. And so that had its own little restrictions, but we sort of came up again. We went back to sort of a real flat style that we knew we could do quickly, and it would render quickly because of the sort of time pressures that we had. And we got it done, we got it on time, and this is one of those sort of really rare occasions, and I remember it had been a really weird day. So we sort of submitted this animation, and it'd gone quiet for a couple of days, and usually that's a little bit worrying. You're waiting for some feedback. And I went, all right, I'll give him a ring. I said, you've had it for a couple of days, and just wondering what the feedback is. And the guy went, oh no, we haven't got any feedback, it's great. And that's probably the only time in my entire career that has ever happened. And I still start to pinch myself that happened. I think it's probably more to do with the pressure they were under that they had to let it go, but I like to think they were just very perfectly happy with it. They all sort of lasted around 5 weeks, 6 weeks. The games are very small. The ideas are kind of like sketches of game ideas. But I was as well as telling stories, I'm really interested in telling. I wanted to tell quite meaty stories, kind of things with substance. I was really interested in telling stories that had a kind of meaning behind them, and this is kind of the journey behind those kind of games that we ended up making. So the first sort of game that we got that was like that was BBC were doing a series about called Shakespeare Retold, I think it was called, and it was contemporary remakes of Shakespeare plays, and they wanted a game to go online with that, and it played out. I think there was 6 episodes of this TV program, and they wanted a sort of adventure game that would play out over the 6 weeks that it was on telly. So there'd be a new episode released each week. So this was our first sort of bigger game, and we learnt quite a lot in it. We made some mistakes. There's a lot of pressure to get this thing turned out week on week, but we managed to do it. But really, it was a massive learning curve. But what it led to is it was noticed by a commissioner at Channel 4. So they, at Channel 4 at that point, had set up a branch of Channel 4 Learning, which to that point had just dealt in television. So all Channel 4 Learning projects were TV projects. And they play out at all funny times. They play out early in the morning, they play out in the middle of the night. And they were aimed at sort of teens upwards, so a kind of interesting audience. With this new team that come into Channel 4, they said, we want to take all the money that you spend on TV and we want to put it onto online. We'll make a couple of TV projects, but basically want to take the majority of it and go where the audience is and put these projects online. So very early days, they were looking around for people to work with and people to pitch ideas to them. And one of the people there had seen the Shakespeare game that we had made, and they approached us and they said, you know, we'd like you to make a game for us. And so they had a program at that point that was called Georgian Vice, I think it was called. And they wanted, so because it was their first project, they wanted something to sort of tie into a TV thing, so they could sort of talk to their telly people about it, and they had a little crossover and cross-fertilisation. So this project was sort of my chance to take out my frustrations as an unfulfilled film director. So we sort of approached it that we were going to tell this kind of story, this sort of episodic story that would play out over 5 episodes. But we were, instead of like animating it or using still characters, we were going to film it. So we'd film actors against green screen, in costume, and then composite them onto sort of 3D backgrounds. So you can see here how it works. So we basically made sort of virtual sets that we render out stills for and then composite our characters onto it. I'll put it on that slide because then I can see what I've written. Now, we would sort of often sort of, you know, there's a lot of research involved in these projects, and it's quite, you know, interesting to go back and look at the different etchings and engravings of that time. So like when I was talking about the Troy project, we looked at Greek urns, but here we looked at things like people like Hogarth and cartoonists of the time. And what we actually did for some of the rooms and some of the sets, we actually just built a sort of Hogarth etching as a sort of room, placed our characters in it. So again, the process is really complicated. You know, you're making a story. You know, each story was self-contained, but it had an arc as well. So there was kind of a different. Basically, each episode dealt with a different kind of crime from that era, and the idea behind it was that each sort of, you know, a lot of period dramas are very romantic or very fluffy. We wanted to go. The idea behind this was it's going to look at crime at that time, and the first police force, the Bow Street Runners. So it dealt with things like smuggling, prostitution, all of these different crimes that were really like part of the gang culture of London at the time. And it was really important to give it that sort of dramatic depth, that I was trying to get something in it that was as good as a television drama, was close to as you could get to a television drama, with the acting, with the writing in particular, but then also trying to marry that up to how games can tell stories, or, you know, and sometimes they fight each other, and that's quite difficult, and that's part of the learning curve of this, you know, learning curve, that sometimes what a game needs to do is different to what a story needs to do, and it's trying to find that sweet spot between those two. Otherwise, you know, you don't want to play a game where you're just watching loads of cutscenes. You know, it's all things like that. You want to feel like you're immersed and you're kind of involved in the story. Now, we planned this whole game. We went back, and you know, the most efficient way I thought to plan it was to storyboard the whole thing out. So made storyboards and planned out each and every shot. So this was kind of like a checklist for every shot that we were going to need. So sometimes you'd have branching, so sometimes there'd be, not a lot of it, but you'd have shots that you would see if you only went a certain way. So the way the game worked is that you would, there'd be a crime, you'd go out and you'd investigate it, you'd talk to different people, you'd find different clues, things would happen. And at the end of the game, you sort of met your superior and you presented the evidence, and you either got a conviction or you didn't get a conviction, and you got these different endings depending on the ending that you picked. So, you know, we had probably 70, 100, a few hundred shots, over 100 shots. It's a composite with different backgrounds, and there'd be bits of After Effects in there on top. Colour grading sort of match it all together and give it a very distinctive kind of look. And I'll just show you the trailer so you can see what it looks like. again, you know, work on quite a sort of restricted budget, so there was lots of like the same people wearing different hats and different outfits, walking past the camera at different times, and using the same people multiple times and compositing them in to make it look like we had crowds of people. Lots of little tricks like that to try and make it look like a bigger production and a bigger thing than it actually was. But this led into our next project for Channel 4. So while when it was based on a TV programme, they came to us and said, like, completely blank slate, what would you like to make? And we've sat around for a while, and that's quite tricky. You've got a blank slate, what am I going to think of? And we thought we want to make something very similar, but we want to progress it. And we wanted to tell a story that's a lot smaller in sort of scale. It's 4 characters in a room talking to each other, and they talk through their day and their backstory. But we sort of hung it on this idea that we want to make something in sort of near future England. There's these characters in a room. And basically we realised that it's going to be a thing about civil liberties. It's going to be about things that were happening at the time and things that we were giving up pretty easily. There was lots of things around ID cards, lots of sort of paranoid advertising about watching your neighbours. It's, you know, a lot of these sort of things were happening, but we didn't quite have the things sort of to gel it together until we saw this. And this is a map of a town somewhere in England. I can't remember where. I think it's London. Yeah, it's in London. And basically that black area there is a restricted area. So teenagers are not allowed inside that area after a certain time. So basically putting a curfew on people under a certain age. And that kind of gave us the idea for this project. So we took that as our start point, and the idea that sort of members of society were targeted depending on their age, sexuality, origin, that kind of thing, by government, and had different rules for different members of society. So there's a kind of thing there. We've developed a system called sort of A-class citizens and B-class citizens. I'll just play a little bit of this, but I won't play all of it.
Are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin.
So previously, the previous project, we made like a little pilot. So we made an interactive pilot, and we shot people against green screen. We made like a little cross-section of the game where you could talk to characters and play. So by this point, they knew that we could do that. They knew that we could build that. So the idea that we had this time, we had a little bit of development budget to sell in the idea we made this sort of party political broadcast. So instead of selling in technology or the kind of game itself, we sold in the world that we were going to make. We sold in a backstory. So this piece of work certainly gives the story leading up to the game. And this is the thing that essentially won us the project. So again, it was a similar process. You know, we storyboarded it all out. But this time, sort of just added colour and thought about the colours that we were going to use for each sort of scene and each sort of sequence. We kind of wrote an outline of the story that we were going to tell, what the arcs were, and then we approached a writer, a guy called Kieran Gillen, who writes for comics, but he also was a games journalist. So he kind of, interestingly, he understood story, he understood narrative, but he also understood how games work. So you had a writer that was ideally positioned to work on something like this. And what we did, we sort of built a world, really. We had rules and we had restrictions, we had backstory. And by doing that, we built this world that you could drop a character into. And then their story would sort of evolve from how they would react and how they would be treated by the world that they were dropped into. So we, as part of building this world, we built lots of sort of propaganda and things that were scattered around the game, lots of advertising, things that sort of just helped you sort of ease you into the kind of world that it was. And it was kind of quite a big sort of world building exercise. So we had lots of things like we come up with ideas for technology. We came up for different rules for how technology was used and different ways things were restricted. And so it's a really sort of simple plot. There's a kind of, you as a character are given a bit of information. You end up in this sort of safe house where characters end up after curfew. And you talk to 4 characters and you decide from talking to those 4 characters and hearing their stories, who you're going to give this information to at the end of the game. And depending on how you've interacted with those characters, that would decide the outcome of the game. So it's kind of a game about trust, really, when it boils down to it. A game about listening and a game about sort of reacting. I could play this little bit. So we also got to make these sort of 30-second sort of promotional trailers that were shown across TV to try and get people online, which, you know, didn't really work because people don't really come from TV to online in that way. But it was nice to get that kind of budget to kind of like, they were treating it like a very serious and very big project. And we ended up getting the actors we want, and like the previous project, what was really nice, we could get it scored as well. So we didn't have to source music, we could get a composer on board to work on it, pull it all together. But the kind of key thing about this project is that it's is what tied in what I was really interested in. It was about making games that were about something, that had something to say, and crucially gave people something to think about afterwards. And that doesn't mean it's not fun, and it's not boring and not worthy. You know, you've seen a lot of educational stuff that's just tedious and it's boring and it's just preachy, but it's just making something that's entertaining but also had some kind of message behind it that some people could think about. So I'll just go skip on to the last project we did for Channel 4 Education. So we'd made a game about crime in Georgia and London. We made this game about civil liberties in the sort of future and thinking about where your vote goes. And this brief came out from Channel 4 for the next sort of round of things that they were doing, and they were looking for games and ideas around fashion. So we went around and I think Simon office went, let's make a game about a sweatshop. I went, oh, fuck off. And he went, no, we can do it. And I was like, all right, how do we do it? And, you know, it's quite a, you know, tricky topic to sort of tackle. So we went away and we thought about it. And we thought about different ways that we could do it. And we looked at, there are a couple of things out there, we were teaching about sweatshops, but they're really boring and they're really dry and they didn't really get anyone involved. So we thought about it and we worked with an artist that we like called Gary Lucan. And we came up with some concept designs. And we wanted to make it look deceptively kind of cute. We wanted to make it like a really sweet and fun looking game. And we made these little sort of icon guys, these little characters, and then you got a little hint of what actually the meat of the game was going to be about. So essentially, it's a game where you you run a sweatshop. You are in charge of the decisions. You've got a boss above you that's saying, "I need it quicker, faster, cheaper." You've got to produce the items in a very short period of time. They come along this conveyor belt, and you've got to hire workers and put workers on your belt to make it. And it goes over different levels. So it starts off, and it's really, you know, it's designed purposely to be really fun. But by the time you're into it, then we start bringing in different ideas and different messages. And it doesn't stop being fun. But the idea of like, okay, child workers, they're pretty cheap. You know, a guy that is responsible for maintaining the machinery, he's quite expensive. So maybe he's a shortcut. The guy that is the fire sort of engineer, he's quite expensive too. So what shortcuts do you make? When do you bother to buy them a toilet? Do you buy them a fan? All those kind of decisions are your decision as a player. So you're having fun. You're trying to sort of win the game and meet the conditions to win the game. But at the same time, you have sort of like realise that you've got all these sort of moral choices that you're making all the way along. And that's the really interesting things that games can do, is that giving you that kind of agency to make those kind of choices that's really immersive. And what is really good is that we've come from this sort of crossover of television and working on projects, that when it came to work on a game like this, we knew how to make it in terms of treating it like a documentary. So it looks fun and it looks great and it is fun to play, but all the facts and all the things in the games are checked and verified, and we work with experts and consultants to make sure that everything that was in there was okayed and right, and we were saying the right thing. And we weren't preaching either. We weren't saying right or wrong answers. We were essentially saying, you know, giving all the information and let people decide for themselves. And that was really important. It was just about stimulating conversation and making people think. Because there was no easy answers, there was no easy sort of solutions to these problems, but you could give people all the facts and make them think for themselves. And what was really interesting is that when this happened, when this went out and it went online, that in sort of gaming forums and places where the game was reviewed, instead of like arguing about game mechanics, people start talking about the issues, they start talking about sweatshops, they start talking about how they played it and how they started thinking after they played it. And that, you know, you got things like numbers, you know, people that view it and people play it, which is good feedback, but then people actually engaging with the topic that you were talking about. And that was the real sort of like key takeaway and success from this project, that it was actually making people think. You know, the best thing I read was something like, I really loved this game, it was great. And then I felt really guilty. And when I read that comment, I was just absolutely overjoyed that I'd actually managed to make someone feel bad about enjoying playing this game. Well, thank you for listening and coming out in the horrendous weather.